וישכם אברהם בבוקר אל המקום אשר עמד שם על פני השם. In the morning, Avraham hurried to the place where he had stood before God, and looking down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and all the land of the plain, he saw the smoke of the land rising like the smoke of a kiln. The context of Abraham's witness was different than my own. The moral implications of the story quite different and ultimately unhelpful in understanding what happened on October 7th. These are not the same stories. The geography is different too. Sodom and Gomorrah were in the Rift Valley on the eastern side of Eretz Israel. Ofakim, Kibbutz Be'eri, the places I visited this past Monday are in Otef Aza, due west from the Dead Sea, in or near land once occupied by the Philistines. And yet, when I consider Abraham's emotional experience of that moment, the anxiety he probably felt about his family members who lived in Sodom, and questions about whether they had survived, when I consider the backstory of sexual violence and Abraham's battle to spare innocence, when I ponder the scene, Abraham's sensory experience, gazing at the wanton destruction, the smoke rising, the story feels eerily, hauntingly familiar. One of my favorite midrashim, which I've shared with you before, is of Abraham encountering a bira doleket ba'esh, a burning palace. I'm not going to share the whole story again now, but what matters for our purposes is that he takes an interest, that he bothers to look, and that his looking and asking prompts a divine response. And what is that response? You had better put out this fire, because though I care, I'm not going to do it for you. At the conservative yeshiva this week, we met with author Ilana Kershan, and I had an opportunity to revisit this text. Kershan brought a commentary on this midrash that I had not seen previously. It's from Rabbi Tzadok HaKohen of Lublin, who teaches, God says to Abraham, you yourself are part owner of this building, because the whole world saw this, but their hearts were not stirred. Their hearts were not stirred to ask what you are asking. To see, to stand in witness is to care. The Talmud suggests that when we stand at the gates of heaven, we'll be asked a series of questions like, were you honest in business? Did you make regular time for Torah study? One of these questions is, tzipita lishua, did you expect salvation? But the verb tzipa is more active than the translation implies. The word litzapot, to anticipate, is closely related to the word litzpot, which means to gaze. To witness something heartbreaking or unjust is to expect it to get better, and by implication, to help bring that healing or repair about. We gaze at an unredeemed world, and we cannot unsee, and having seen, we feel called to act. This is what the midrash about Abraham implies. He knows that to look obligates him in some way, but he looks anyway. That's why I think so many don't look. And I get it. Peering into these things is hard, especially if the images are horrifying or the stories teach us something inconsonant to our previously held beliefs. It's so much easier not to look, because caring is hard and acting even harder. Now, to be clear, I don't think it a failure to tune out social media or news cycles if you're someone who cannot handle disturbing images or gut-wrenching stories. There are plenty of deeply caring people who cannot and need not access that caring by staring into the abyss. And many of those people still find plenty of ways to fill the world with goodness. But I also know that when many people close their eyes, they also close their hearts. And when too many people refuse to look, you know what happens then. The palace keeps burning until there's nothing left. The rabbis of the Talmud had the humility to recognize that seeing might show them something unexpected, but that surprise should not prevent them from looking. The Talmud offers more than one instance in which there is a dispute between sages as to how we should practice. What is the halacha, they ask, and they say, Pok chazi mai amadavar, go out and see what the people are doing. They understand that looking, that seeing, is risky, but important when determining halacha. They also understand it's risky but important when contemplating the destruction of our people. Rabbi Yossi said, I once was walking along the road when I entered the ruins of Jerusalem to pray. Elijah of blessed memory came and guarded the entrance for me and waited at the entrance until I finished my prayer. Maybe the soldiers who guarded us were some manifestation of Elijah as we stood in the ruin of Kibbutz Be'eri, as we gazed into the Chorvah, as we chanted El Malei Rachamim, as we said the words of Kaddish. Elijah chides Rabbi Yossi for entering the ruin because it was dangerous. But the story and Rabbi Yossi's willingness to pok chazi, to go and see, is also revelatory. He hears in that solemn place a heavenly voice cooing like a dove, mourning our destruction. I heard that voice. I felt the reverberations of that dove. God grieves for the destruction of our people. God grieves for the exile from our land. Hine lo yanum velo yishan shomer Yisrael, the guardian of Israel, neither slumbers nor sleeps, says the psalmist. God's eyes are open to death and suffering, but so very many human beings are closing their eyes, closing their minds and their hearts. On October 7th, a palace burned to the ground. I saw it with my own eyes. It was horrifying. We know from this week's Parsha that peering, that looking, can be dangerous. As Eshet Lot looked and became a pillar of salt. There's a wonderful modern midrash in a new collection called Dirshuni, written by Israeli women, that describes the process of Eshet Lot becoming a pillar of salt, not because she was punished, not because she was somehow struck down for looking, but because having looked, her eyes welled up with tears. And she was so overwhelmed that her tears fell. And she became frozen within them, within the pillar of salt of her own tears. There is a way that looking can make us still, can force us to feel unable to move, fossils stuck in space and in time. But that palace did burn to the ground, and I did see it. And though the tears were there, it's important, I think, to say so. Because too many claim that it did not, or that it was supposed to burn, or worse, that we Jews burned it ourselves, There are too many people closing their eyes to what happened in Ofakim and Be'eri and Kfar Aza and Sderot and the Supernova Music Festival. There are too many people who insist the violence was not as gruesome as it was, or worse, that it was deserved. That Rachel and John Poland, whom I met in Jerusalem, deserved to have their 23-year-old son Hirsch taken from them to Gaza. That Hirsch deserved to have his left arm blown off. Many murdered in their beds, Rabbanit Racheli Sprecher-Frankel, whom we also met, whose son Naftali Frankel was abducted with 2 other soldiers and murdered by Hamas in 2014. Many of those on October 7th, she said, were extreme left activists. Many who were killed trying to save them were extreme right activists. None of them deserved what happened to them. None of them. Nor did Michal, who we met at Hadassah Hospital, a nurse from Kochav HaShachar, whose family volunteered at Zikim base just north of Gaza and hosted 100 soldiers for a Simchas Torah meal while her husband related stories about Yom Kippur and the Yom Kippur War 50 years prior, who took her 8 kids into the shelter when the red alert went off and ran out to try to help when the shooting started because, as she said to us, only any nurse would have done it. Who stabilized a female soldier whose eye had been taken and was then shot 3 times in her arm. Who then instructed soldiers on how to apply a tourniquet, had the presence of mind to give medical advice even as she was bleeding. Whose children will require psychological help maybe for the rest of their lives. Michal didn't deserve that, did she? What about Ronit, the elderly woman in her pink flannel PJs with a headscarf that we also met at Hadassah, who was just on her way home from the store when the siren went off in Jerusalem? And because she was older and because she was sitting toward the back of the bus, didn't quite make it to the shelter in time when the Hamas rocket sent indiscriminately towards civilian targets, deliberately towards civilian targets, exploded and tore through her leg. Did she deserve her fate for the sin of living a few meters over the green line? Did the occupation make the rocket fall on that civilian occupation? Of course not. Hamas did that. How many of us feels, or how any of us feels about the occupation or the settlements, and you know how I feel about them, has nothing to do with this. Nothing. But on college campuses around the country and in rallies around the world, people are saying otherwise. They're saying, or they're implying, that Michal and Ronit and Hirsch deserve their fate, or that Israel alone is to blame for their lot, or that 242 hostages, young and old, Jewish, Muslim, and Christian, are not what we should be concerned about in this moment, or that 1,400 people murdered in cold blood by 3,000 terrorists are not the story we should be paying attention to. Like the story of Mohammed Darwash, who we met in Emek Rephaim in the German colony, whose family hails from Palestine and has lived in the same village for 27 generations, and fights day in, day out for full acceptance and improved conditions for nearly 2 million Palestinian citizens of Israel every day, whose cousin was a paramedic on the scene at the Supernova Music Festival and was shot and killed by Hamas while trying to save the life of a fellow Israeli citizen. Isn't he worth paying attention to? Mr. Darwish didn't ask us to ignore his family's suffering. He can mourn for innocent civilians in Gaza and innocent civilians in Israel at the same time. He can expect the IDF will not kill indiscriminately and call out mistakes when they occur, or call out malicious attacks and slayings by Jewish settlers in the West Bank without losing the moral clarity of who Hamas is and what they did and what they'll continue to do if left unchecked. The world needs people who can see, who can look and care and act, who resist reductive dogmas, but who are still able to call out real evil when it occurs, who are as okay with our people exercising power as any other people. Pok chazi. Once we see, I hope we feel called to act. We sent out an email yesterday with a number of things that you can do to support Israel right now. The energy bars and the wet wipes and the power banks and the cards so lovingly created by children and adults here at Beth Am that you brought to me last Shabbos were such a gift to Israelis, soldiers on the front line and others. I can tell you that our group of leaders' ability to just show up was so incredibly appreciated. Israelis are feeling so very isolated right now. So send messages of support to family and friends over there. Let them know that you're with them and love them and you're standing by them. But you can also send funds to support the incredible work of Lev Yisrael, the civilian command center, which has pivoted from the essential democracy and civil society work it was doing through the mass protests over so many months to the equally essential work it's doing to support Israelis during this war with Hamas. You can donate to support World Center Kitchen, which is fighting hunger on both sides of the Gaza-Israel border. And you can learn about and fight for the release of 242 human beings, hostages from 9 months old to 85 years old, who have been held in captivity by Hamas for a full month now. There are specific things you can do, like calling your elected officials every day, and the email that we sent out tells you how to do that and gives you language for it. There's been a lot of talk about standing with Israel, standing up for Israel, and standing up is important to be sure, but showing up is even more powerful. Abraham stood up, Asher Amad Sham at Sdom and Amorah, but he showed up before when he was arguing for sparing of innocent lives. Hashofet kol haaretz lo ya'aseh mishpat, shall not the judge of all the earth do justice? He demanded. I had the privilege not just to stand up for Israel, but to show up and gaze into the abyss this week. I feel haunted, broken, but blessed to have been able to do so. But you can show up too. Some of you did so with Rav Tyler yesterday at the event at Oab Shalom Har Sinai. You can show up tomorrow in the evening for the Global Day of Learning at Chizuk Emunah. And if you come to my class, and there'll be a number of wonderful classes, I'll tell you and I'll show you more about my journey. You can show up by donating and calling your U.S. representatives and senators to demand the release of the hostages. You can show up by calling out anti-Semitism when you see it and insist on our people's right to self-defense. When I think of what I saw when I went to the Chorva, the ruin of Kibbutz Be'eri, there's one image that I just can't shake. It was a grand cypress tree growing next to the haunted house that we were permitted to enter. The heat from the fire that consumed that house and the 4 people inside it was so intense that it singed one entire side of that cypress tree. I can't stop thinking about it because I could tell that while the house will have to be torn down, and we were standing there in the rubble of house after house after house, that was being torn down one by one as the IDF did the incredibly challenging work of identifying remains, cataloging what had happened there, and then allowing these places to fall to the earth. That while those houses are being torn down, the cypress tree will recover. It will grow and flourish once again because its roots are deep and strong, and God willing, the state of Israel will do that too. Pok Chazi, when I went, I saw so much also to be hopeful about. And we must be hopeful because the evil visited upon our people by Hamas cannot, must not win the day. Looking is hard and it takes its toll. But having seen, I must care, and I must ask you to do the same. The Hebrew poet, Dr. Hillel Bavli, wrote, "May my heart be open to every broken soul, to orphaned life, to every stumbler wandering unknown and groping in the shadow. Bless my eyes, purify me to see humanity's beauty rise in the world and the glory of my people in its redeemed land, spreading its fragrance over all the earth. Ken Yehi Ratzon. May we see this when we look, and may that be God's will. Shabbat Shalom.